a podcast about the game of life and the hero's journey we all experience. Let's jump in with our host, Dylan Watkins, as he introduces today's guest.
Are you curious to learn about identity from someone who's a nobody? Well, on today's podcast, I have Sam LaCrosse. He is a self-affirmed nobody. He hasn't done anything amazing. He is not extraordinary or impressive. He's just an ordinary guy from Cleveland, Ohio, who now lives an ordinary life in Austin, Texas. But if you want to check him out, he writes blogs on the don'treadthisblog.com. That is an official don'treadthisblog.com. He hosts the Don't Listen to This podcast. Sam is the CEO, the founder of Don't Do This LLC, a company that makes no money. And he is also the board member of a Thrive Living Corporation and ambassador to the Rally Cap Sports. So without any delay, I'd like to welcome Sam.
Dylan, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate both the authenticity of the bio and you having me on, brother. Appreciate you.
No, absolutely, man. I was trying to say, like, it sounds like if I read the bio, I'm angry at you. You know, it's like I'm trying like so many people are like, what? Yeah, I get a lot of theme through everything. I think identity is really interesting, something to study a lot. But I'd love to get just a little bit of the history of nobody himself, and learning how you kind of came across this.
Sure. Well, like the bio says, and some of the, if you think it's factual or not, there are some, a couple facts in there. So it's, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, was raised up there for the first 18 years of my life. Two parents, two siblings, a dog usually around. And then I went to school in Columbus, Ohio. I took a job out in Boston, Massachusetts during the first outbreak of COVID in the spring of 2020, and then moved out to Austin in the following May. And then kind of just was on the way, just wanted to, I work in tech sales currently, but I do all my media stuff on the side. So I started my blog in 2020, my podcast in 2021, and then my book came out in 2022. And so all of that really, I would think, recycles into it at least and feeds into it a little bit, I would say, in all my mediums. And it actually, the genesis, the idea for the book actually started on my blog. So I had, two kind of first blog posts. One was the "Hi, I have a blog" post. And then the other one was actually what turned out to be eventually chapter 4 in the book, which is a chapter on value economics. And so that was where the genesis of both the blog, the podcast, and the book all kind of came from, was that initial post. Got
it. It's super interesting. I mean, I think identity is really important. A lot of people label onto it. They hold on to it. You can, if you look at a lot of things around psychology and identity, you have this weird conundrums of humans, that you have thoughts that turn into actions, that turn into habits, that sometimes turn into identity, but that's not always true. You can flip that over and stuff like that. And I'd love to kind of get a little bit of, if you could kind of give us just a bit of value economics, the study of the identity, your book that's come out, just so kind of people can kind of wrap their idea around, or, the concept itself.
Yeah, sure. So I think, to your point, identity, if not being the biggest question in our culture now, it's one of the biggest questions in our culture now, at least in my opinion. And I think there have been a lot of extrapolating ideas and thoughts about what identity actually means to people. And I think my best guess as I can come up to identity is that it is defined at the individual level. I think especially in the recent years, we've seen a lot of people who have been put into groups based on either ethnicity or religion or skin color or gender or sexual orientation or whatever. And those things do matter, but I don't believe that they matter as much as what the individual person makes up that might be reflective of a kaleidoscope of all those identities. I think you have to treat a person as a person first and as an individual first. And so then at that level, I was saying, okay, well, what makes up a person? Like, what makes up their individual self? And in my household, at least, I was raised by my parents, particularly my father, who would mention values in almost every day of my life. And so I was taught very young from both my parents, my grandparents, a lot of my family members, that values were the key to discovering what your identity is as a person, at least with my construct of the idea when I was young and growing up. And then I kind of realized when I grew up, I didn't know how to define what a value was. And so I knew what they were in abstract. We all know what certain things are in abstract, but when you're asked for a concrete definition, what that definition is. So there's a lot of things that we see in daily life, like, what is a circle, a square? There's documented that's out that what is a woman? And we all know what these things are in abstract now. But when you break it down to the nuts and bolts, what are those things? And so I really kind of started to challenge myself internally and say, okay, what is a value? What are values? And I realized I really didn't know what those things were. And I said, well, that's kind of an interesting question that could solve a bigger question. And so that was when I kind of went off on my own to really discover and go on this journey. And the way I initially thought about it, it was in the summer of 2019. And I remember thinking about the relationship between sacrifice and value. And so I just was, weird things that I just kind of think about in my head or whatever. And so I was, thinking about this is a relationship between two things. And the thing that I said was basically the more you sacrifice something, the more you probably value that something. And the less you sacrifice to get that something, the less you probably value that something. And so I thought that kind of made sense. And so I was sitting in my senior year of college in early 2020 and late 2019 and kind of saying, we were in an economics class and I was a senior in college and I kind of had senioritis at that point. So I was kind of checked out in the back of the room, but we were talking about supply and demand curves or very simple relationships between two things. And I said, well, wait a second. This is a relationship between two things. That's a relationship between two things. So what if, in order to kind of conceptualize and explain this idea, I took those two things and tried to model it. And so that eventually became what I saw in my first blog post, which is basically a parody or spin-off of the supply and demand graph with value and sacrifice being the inputs instead of supply and demand. And then I thought it worked well. And I thought I reasonably explained the idea. And so the next month I said, okay, why don't I do a chapter 2? And then I did a chapter 3 and a chapter 4 and I got all the way up to chapter 7 or 8. And then I was like, okay, I think I might have something here. So I really just kind of took that and I analyzed it and I said I should probably try to go for this. And I already had kind of a publisher in mind and what I wanted to say about the book. And I just needed to refine some things. And then that eventually turned out to be Value Economics Study of Identity, which came out on June 28th of 2022 of this year. So
it's fascinating. I mean, it makes a ton of sense too. I mean, looking at just the value curves, right? You're talking value versus sacrifice. And if you're looking at that relationship of, you only know if you value something if you're willing to sacrifice for it.
Yep.
Right. And, I think, one of the misconceptions I had that, I came across fairly recently was the idea of addictions versus commitments. Right. Right. And if you look at that, what do you think is true freedom? Right. If you're looking at true freedom, right. People have thought that what true freedom is I want what I want when I want it. Right. Like I'll have it whenever.
Yep.
Right. That's whatever. I want it, but that's more of an addiction, right? If you look at a commitment, that's really a value set, which is I want what I want no matter what. No matter if I'm tired, no matter if I'm hungry, no matter if I'm upset, no matter if my ego gets in the way, no matter if any of that stuff, right? And so I think the difference I think people confuse in terms of freedoms is they confuse addictions. I want a healthy body, but I also want to be able to shove my face with cheeseburgers throughout the day, all day long. You really start to see what people are willing to sacrifice for what they value, and this difference between, I think, the illusion of freedom is so, that's kind of that's what's resonating with me along the path. Have you seen what other ones have you seen in terms of that relationship that really stand out?
I would say the key thing that you said with all of those type of situations is either. Well, the freedom is an interesting point because, addiction is a type of slavery when you really look at it. It's a form of mental and physiological slavery because, when you're addicted to drugs or you're addicted to alcohol, and later in the book, I explain kind of some things that I was kind of going down the wrong path of being addicted to as well. Not anything as serious as that, thank God. But, you don't really get to choose whether you want to do those things or not. You just have them chosen for you by your brain overpowering other parts of your brain. But I think the other key word in your mentioning in your definition of that was commitment. So what I say in the book, I don't know if I say this directly, but I make a lot of references to this, is that, good fathers don't become good fathers by accident. Like good marriages don't become good marriages by accident. You have to really, really work at them. And anyone who is exceptional, I wrote a post on my blog and did a podcast called The True Cost of Greatness. And a couple, I would say about a year and a half ago now. And I said the people that are truly great at something, and great is a very, very, I think, overused word in our society. I think a lot of those superlatives are kind of overused in a lot of ways. But I think the people that are truly great at something got there because they sacrificed nearly everything in their life to obtain that something. And you look at basically a lot of, I think, rock stars are probably one of the easiest examples to name. Like how many rock stars who have just changed the world, who have changed the way we looked at music, like Aerosmith or Led Zeppelin or any of those guys. They are, I'm seeing Motley Crue in about a month down in San Antonio. I'm coming from Austin now. And, I don't know if you've seen the Netflix movie about them, but those dudes wrecked a lot of part of their lives to get famous. And they were really, really famous. They were one of the greatest. They're in my opinion, one of the greatest rock bands of all time. My parents actually saw them last week too. My dad and my mom were huge fans of them. My dad especially. But those guys, they sacrificed a lot of their life to get what they wanted to get, which is basically becoming one of the greatest rock bands in the history of the world. And this is the same with all business people, with all really, really good fathers, with all really good mothers, with all really good people that are in charge of something, or responsible for something, church leaders, community leaders, all these other people. And so I think commitment is the key thing with all of this other stuff. And, this kind of goes into a couple other points in the book about choosing what hard you want to live with in your life, because commitments are never easy to obtain throughout your entire course of your life. Like, no matter who you marry or who you spend most of your time with or whichever that's going to be, it's not going to be easy to sustain that thing. You really have to kind of work at it. You have to go through hard times to get that. But once you do, then I think it reaps greater value than not having something of commitment that you can hang your hat on at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it always feels good afterwards, man. It's like going to the gym or doing anything else. You have the easy fun versus the hard fun. And the easy fun is the slacking off and Netflix or whatever you might be doing, and then or the other ones at the end of it. So you get that pride in yourself, that identity of accomplishment, right? Which is interesting. Have you seen any models or things? I mean, you had one of those models you're talking about, value versus sacrifice. Are there any of these other models that can help you identify your identities or your values or your traits?
Yeah, I would say that the one that I think is very, very interesting is the one that is focused on chapter 6, which is diminishing returns of value. So there's a concept inside of chapter 6 that I discuss in economics called diminishing marginal returns. So after a while, this is kind of talking a little bit to your point, I think, about addiction and about a lot of things that people become obsessive compulsive over after a while. There's this concept in economics where it's basically saying you can only add so many things before that good thing becomes a bad thing. And I don't know if I named this example specifically inside of the book, but the reason that the assembly line worked when Henry Ford did the assembly line back when he created Ford Motor Company is that he had just the right amount of people on the assembly line. But if he had less, it wouldn't work. And if he had more, it wouldn't work. And a lot of people would just say probably, if you want to become more productive in an assembly line, just add more people to put on more parts and everything else. But that's not necessarily always the case, because this is the too many cooks in the kitchen dilemma, where you go back and you have a bunch of people trying to make one cake, and people are trying to want to do different things and throw different shit in it and everything like that. And it just doesn't really work at the end of the day. And so you have to realize when to settle when you want to go after something of value, because when you need to settle is probably the most key thing you can do before you fall off a cliff, basically. And I use a lot of, I think, incidents inside of that chapter to describe it, but I don't know if a lot of people in your audience will be familiar with this, but I think the that I used was the Call Her Daddy fallout with the Call Her Daddy podcast. And the story of the Call Her Daddy podcast fallout.
Oh, we seem to have technical difficulties.
Was that Sophia Franklin, who was the part? Sorry about that.
Yeah, we kind of skipped a beat there, but you're back. You're back now. I heard Call Her Daddy podcast, cool. And one of the issues that you had with that. Can you please continue?
Yeah. So I can. Wasn't deep in the story anyway. So I think that the original Call Her Daddy podcast was such a great idea, and there's a reason why it got so popular, and there's a reason why Alex Cooper, in my opinion, is the greatest and the biggest female media personality in the world right now. At least the biggest independent female media personality in the world right now, was because the idea was really good. But the reason why Sophia Franklin could not really reap the value that Alex Cooper is because she didn't know when to settle. She got really greedy. She pressed Dave Portnoy, who was running Barstool Sports, for no more money. She really kind of strained her relationship with Alex Cooper. And then now she's basically, I think after the immediate fallout, she was like living in her mom's basement for 6 months. And Alex Cooper raked in a $60 million Spotify deal while doing a podcast for basically 10 times less the time than Joe Rogan did, who got paid $100 million from Spotify. So you have to know really when to take your losses and when to bounce back and really when to move forward in life. Because if you ride something so hard and so far when it's really not reaping any more value for you, you're going to run into a wall. And I think that can be true of a lot of different things, whether that's a bunch of, whether that's your business, whether that's your relationships, whether that's your friendships, whether that's anything really that you have. You have to know when to really step back and reassess and go forward in another way. Because if you keep riding something for a very long time and it doesn't reap any value for you, then it's not really something you value, in my opinion. It's not.
So it's almost like by the fact of, if you go so hard onto something and you put so much energy in it, the diminishing returns is almost the scarcity of the value. It becomes less scarce because you have an abundance of it. So
right.
Because you have an abundance of the value, the things that aren't scarce aren't valuable. like people, right? You're on, you're having COVID, you never see anybody. You finally go out and you meet someone for the first time at a conference or whatever. You're like, oh my God, people. But if you're in New York City and you've been around there since the beginning, and people all around you, the inherent value of people drop because you're just, people are amazing. They're wonderful, but sometimes it's just too much of anything. So not great. Yeah. That's super interesting. Along with the book's creation, as you're going through and kind of coming across these models and coming out with these terminologies, understanding, just kind of creating a mental model for yourself of, what does it mean to have values and all that. Is there anything that you came across that you wasn't expected? Were there any things, like, I know that the way that you present yourself in the business is a very opposite approach, unintuitive. Are there any other unintuitive revelations that you've come across?
I think this wasn't necessarily an unintuitive realization, and this is an idea I actually sourced from a guy who I look up to quite a bit, Mark Manson, who's one of my favorite author in the world. And he's, I think, a brilliant mind in our society that needs a lot of brilliant minds right now. And I think that the key that I think a lot of people did not realize, and I wanted to kind of hit them with this early in the book, it's actually at the very end of the first chapter, is that the act of having values is also the act of polarizing people. It's the act of polarizing people and not having everybody be okay with your lifestyle all the time. And, you have to have, and I just basically say people as a warning, like, as soon as you adopt values and you live honestly through your values, you are going to alienate some people. You cannot be all things to all people. There's a famous phrase, I don't know who said it, so forgive me, but a man who values everything values nothing. And that's very, very true, because if you really are, and this is the thing with people who say that they're quote unquote, oh, I love inclusivity. I love everybody. I love everybody. And it's like, well, no, you don't. I mean, because, do you love uninclusive people? No, you don't. I mean, I doubt that people who are saying that, I love all people, everything else. It's like, do you really like that person who's like a racist or like it doesn't like people because they're gay or something like that? It's like, no, they probably don't. So even the people that really preach either soul inclusivity or soul, I would say, exclusivity, they really aren't preaching either one of them, because they have to include people, you have to exclude people. So it's all about choosing which of those groups and what people you want to do by living through your values. And I think if you really kind of come to terms with that, you can have a really easier time accepting your values and really living through them as you go on.
Yeah, that's a tricky bit for a lot of people looking at that. I know that, like, because people are like, hey, I believe in unity and I believe that we're all one. So, but then people go against their actual values, and you really find that out when people, when you push comes to shove against their rights, right? And you'll find that out real quick. And I think that you're right. Is when you have values, if you stand for something, then you're going to automatically push against somebody else, which means you're going to be, in a way, you're going to be prejudiced. If you value a healthy body, you see someone with an unhealthy body, you're going to have opinions. If you value a successful business, you see someone unsuccessful, you're going to have opinions. And it's a difficult thing for people to understand with a push against. But I think so many people want to ultimately be liked from everybody that they'll stand for nothing, right? And they'll have that chameleon effect where they'll adopt a stance based upon what group they're a part of, just to be accepted to be a part of the tribe, because we very much want to be autonomous and be individualistic, but they're very much often at the same time we want to be accepted by the tribe, which is, humans are kind of funny in that weird kind of double standard conundrums that we have. Oh, dramatic pause for that one. I think Sam went ahead and froze up again. I believe we are having some technical difficulties. I don't know if this is just the internet. And we are back, I believe. We'll see what's going on here. Sam, where'd you go, buddy? I lost you. Oh, completely out of here. So let's see what's going on here. We had some sort of internet issue. I don't know if it's on my side or on his side. I am internet connected, so I'm gonna check my Wi-Fi connection right now, and we're gonna see what's going on. We'll see if Sam pops back in or whatnot happens. So let's check my internet speed while we're doing this. Internet speed. Is it me, or is it just Sam, or is it me and Sam? Are we doing this together? I tell you one of my values. So one of my biggest values here is connection. I'm very big on connections and communication and having conversations and going at it back and forth and being able to really do that. And so when I can't have connections, it does like, I'm like, oh man, this is rough. Right now, my internet speed seems to be doing like 320. So I'm pretty solid on that. We'll see if Sam comes back here and we're going to see what's going on. Sam! Hey, buddy, you there? From my perspective, I'm looking at it. I see that we've got you with one red bar in terms of reception, and you have a black screen. So I don't know what's happening, brother. Oh, and you're going to come back. Now you've got full bars. And welcome back.
Sorry about that, man. I think that was my internet connection. I think I died out on you, so I apologize about that. Usually never happens, but
yeah, no, I understand. It's okay, man. I was checking my internet speed. I'm like, is it me or is it him or what's going on?
No. I was checking mine too. I was like, oh shit, I didn't know if I messed it up or whatever.
I was talking about it's funny because as we were talking, I was mentioning as I was just talking to the screen here was about one of my biggest values that I realized is on my thing is connection. I'm really big on having good, solid connections in all its forms. So whenever like internet doesn't work, I'm like, oh man, because especially if you're having something like a personal, intimate conversation, or you're going at it right there, and all of a sudden the connection gets dropped, and that could be through technology, or that could be thinking about having to have the groceries done, or leave my pilot on. Right? You're like, wait, are you here? Come back. Hold on, we're in the middle of a conversation. Come back to this. I do want to dive in. So for you, or for nobody, which is weird to say, but for you, what do you have in terms of, have you identified your values, the things that you stand for and what you believe in, the things you stand against?
Yes. So I think in chapter 3 of my book, I name all 5 of my values. I actually list 6 of my values. The 10th chapter is devoted to the 6th value because I think it's the one that basically everybody should have, in my opinion. So my values are, and bear with me if I struggle to remember them. It's funny, I wrote the book and then I forget all these things that are in the book. So it's self-awareness, discipline, responsibility, authenticity, stability, and then myself is the last one.
So you value yourself in terms of like you feel that you're worthy of love, respect, honor. Is that what you mean when you say value yourself?
It's something different than that because I think that I go into the final chapter is called the value scarcity principle. And it's about, the concept, what I have deemed, and maybe someone else has come up with this. So I maybe just regurgitate all these ideas for nothing, but I came up with a concept called self-value. And so we hear a lot of things in our culture currently around, I would say, self-love, self-acceptance, all this kind of stuff. And, there's something to be said for that because you do need to love yourself and you do need to kind of have that appreciation for yourself and kind of what you've gone through in your life, the kind of person you are for doing good things, all that kind of stuff. But you shouldn't love yourself necessarily if you're not doing things that are valuable to yourself. So you need to have that sense of value about yourself before you can love yourself, in my opinion. Because if you're doing bad things, if you're, like you said, if you're eating unhealthy, if you're kind of wrecking all your relationships, if you're being a narcissist, if you're kind of being a really bad friend or a bad husband or bad whatever, then you shouldn't love that about yourself. You shouldn't accept who you are. And I think the scene that or the allegory that I pull into the metaphor into the chapter is, I don't know if you're a Breaking Bad fan at all, but my favorite scene in the whole show of Breaking Bad is when Jesse Pinkman basically drops a nuke on the self-acceptance movement with his speech where he basically admits to his AA group that he did a really, really bad thing. He killed somebody. And he kind of frames it in the sense that he killed a dog that was a quote unquote problem in his neighborhood. And then one of the other addicts who's at this AA meeting, she calls him out on it. And she's basically saying like, how could you do this? How could you kill an innocent dog? How could you do everything else? And Jesse, who's feeling so guilty about this, he feels visibly, you can see it on his face in the camera, he feels a sense of relief that someone is finally telling him that what he is doing to himself and to other people is wrong and that he's doing a bad thing. But then the AA group leader turns back to her and she says, we don't judge people here. We don't do that. You don't yell at people. And then Jesse turns on the group leader and says, well, why not? I did a bad thing. Why shouldn't she correct me when I did a bad thing? And he said, beating the hell out of yourself is not going to do anything else. And he's not going to do everything. And so he's like, okay, so I should just accept that I'm this piece of shit person who just goes out and does whatever he wants and is kind of a hedonist and does whatever he, feels like doing and whatever. And then, so he basically calls the group leader out on a lot of his own stuff that he had shared vulnerably with his drug rehabilitation group. And he kind of just says, you did all these things, and he's like, I lied to you. I've done all these things. the ending line is my favorite part, where he basically says, "I made you my bitch. Do you accept that?" And then he says, "No." And then he's like, "Well, it's about time." And then he gets up and leaves. And so I think that scene is so powerful, because he basically drops a nuke on the entire movement of self-acceptance. Should what you're doing to yourself and what you're doing is quote unquote loving yourself is not really valuable to you. So I tend to go on that concept of valuing myself as the concept of self-value. I do things that are in the best interest of myself and those that I care about and those that share my values. And I think that needs to come before loving yourself, because if you're loving yourself for the wrong reasons, then that's not really loving yourself at all.
Yeah, those are really interesting points. The thing, I think there's nuance. Like, when you say the word love, right? There's a ton of different loves. There's sexual love. There's unconditional love. There's loving with standards, right? And then it's like if you look at it, if you treat your love the way a parent would love a child, and a parent would love a child, they still love their child unconditionally, but at the same time they hold them to a higher standard. And I think there's like that self-acceptance piece that we're missing the part of the conversation, is that when, and we know this in ourselves, we know that there is a certain level of respect, because I don't think it's love, I think it's respect, right? I think it's more respect, right? Because if you disrespect your own word, I'm going to go out and get that job, I'm going to lose that weight, I'm going to go do that thing, right? And then you don't do it, you have this relationship with yourself. I have this relationship with myself that's like, you lying piece of shit. You say you're going to do it, but you don't do it, right? Yeah. And you're like, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay if you let yourself down and let down the people around you and let down everybody that cares about you and, whatever that thing might be. And but the things I think we do like it when people say what we're secretly feeling, even if it's about ourselves, like, hey, get your ass up, get the shit done. It's time to go. It's time to get things done. And when we get that, it's like, thank you. Instead of, and there's like, it's counterintuitive, much like your wonderful bio and podcast name. And,
thank you. I appreciate it.
It's a counterintuitive statement, but you're talking about self-respect, right? And the fact is that if I don't do what I say I'm going to do, and I don't do what I say are my true values, right? And I value honesty and integrity, and I lie to everybody that I meet, I'm gonna have this thing where I'm like, I don't believe myself, right? Which means I didn't earn the right to say I'm someone of worth if I hold no values to myself. So it's a really interesting thing. And I do, from what I've seen, is when someone, at least for myself in my own world, when I'm causing bullshit and somebody shines a light on it, the first instinct is to like snap and be like, what are you doing? Don't look at me. And the second one is like, okay, you're totally right. It's time to go. My hand has been caught, in the cookie jar. It's time to get up and get rolling. It's, do you have in there, because I think this is a very valuable thing on self-acceptance, but it's really about earned self-acceptance. Is there ways to recompense that, or are there things that you've seen along that way to say, okay, well, you might be going off course here, but here's how you can get on course?
That's a really good question. And I don't know if I give a firm prescription inside of the book, because again, I want it to be an individualized look at myself. So I can really only say what my personal experience with self-value was like. And I can go into that if you'd like me to.
Sure.
But I think it's kind of, So I was addicted to pornography for most of my adult life. So I remember and when I say I was addicted to porn, I was I was the hardest core porn addict I'd ever met in my entire life. And so I had really kind of, dove head first into all this other kind of stuff. And I remember it basically, and I was talking with this about my parents yesterday, because, it's kind of an awkward conversation when you write about having a porn addiction and your parents read the book and you're like, oh, that's going to be a conversation I really don't want to have at some point later. And so that was an interesting conversation, even though they were very, very cool about it. So shout out to mom and dad on that one. But
mom, quit doing my laundry. I got it. Leave it alone.
No, dude, it was weird, because I knew, it was all over my LinkedIn. I knew a lot of my work colleagues are going to see this, and I was I don't really know what's going to. So it was. Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's a legitimate problem that a lot of people are talking about. I think it's a very, very legitimate problem that a lot of people aren't talking about. So I think it could have killed two birds with one stone there. But basically, the end of the day is that, I was so I valued myself so little that I was living basically a fake life. And I kind of really did everything that I could to try to, again, be all things to all people, appease everybody, do everything that I wasn't really passionate about doing, or not passionate about doing, but should have been doing, I should say. Like I should have been going out and living my life in more of a constructive fashion. And it got to a point where I was, watching porn twice a day for probably about 2 hours. I planned my entire life around it. I planned when I stalked my roommate's schedule in college where he would be out of the room so I can have the room to myself and do all this other stuff. I was staying up way too late. I was looking at my screen so many times. I was objectifying women. I was an incel, basically. I was a glorified incel for most of my, adult life. And I still am working my way out of that. I don't think I'm an incel anymore, but it was getting really, really bad and really, really destructive to where, I could be, I was wrecking my life. I did not have a life. And so I think that, I ultimately had to look myself in the mirror, and it got to, I think, you have to get to a point where you reach really, really peak disgust almost with your behavior about what you're doing. Like I remember it got to a certain point. I don't go into really graphic detail in the book, but I say a few pretty graphic things that, I was watching inside of that kind of stuff. And I remember I would finish, my quote unquote session when I was watching porn or whatever, whatever you want to call it. And, I remember just almost like retching in my bed, like dry heaving, because I was so disgusted with the things I was watching. And I was like, I looked at myself, I'm like, you're kind of a disgusting person for like revolving your life around this kind of a sun. Like you're not a very constructive person. You're not a very positive person inside of society. Like you need to get your shit together. And so I remember just looking at that and having a moment to myself where it was like, this central thing that I fixated on for a while was the thing that distracted me from all my pain in my life, which I detailed through and everything else. And what I want to, clarify this too. I was not like abused as a child. I didn't have a lot of stuff. I have, other things that a lot of people have to deal with on an individual level. But, that was the way I coped with a lot of the stuff that was going on in my life, was that I would go and, relieve myself by, getting that dopamine hit off of watching porn. That was what I would do, So I basically used that as kind of my referendum by saying, I was here. I hit this peak of just self-loathing, self-disgust. I didn't like myself. I hated myself a lot of the time for what I was doing and how I was kind of, sucked into this rabbit hole of objectifying women, objectifying myself, not treating people with respect, not treating myself with respect, to your point. And I had to course correct. And then thank God I was, at that point, getting started into blogging and all this other stuff. And I could write out my feelings and kind of get my feelings out in a more constructive way. And I end the chapter with basically saying that I'm going to be basically addicted to porn and sex and sexual deviancy for probably the rest of my life. And that there's a reason why, drug addicts and Alcoholics Anonymous meetings exist when people have been sober for 35 years. It's because the truly honest people, in my opinion, and I did a lot of research into addiction while doing that chapter, they know they're going to be addicted for the rest of their life. They know their brain chemistry is permanently altered by what their past existence told them was true about themselves. And so I basically wrote that in the end of the book to say that, it's either you live by this other set of values, or you're probably going to get sucked into your other destructive set of values if you don't counteract that with something, So that was kind of my personal reference point by saying, like, I was just such in a bad place that I really wanted to get out of it so badly, more than anything I ever wanted to do in my entire life. And I was telling my parents the other day, there are a lot of people who really, I don't think, don't get as lucky as I do, because, I'm, normally, you probably can't see it right now, but I have, an island in the middle of my counter in my apartment, and I like whiskey, and I have a whole shelf of whiskey, like right on my island. And I knew that I've known a lot of alcoholics. I know a lot of functioning alcoholics right now. I knew that if they had that same shelf of whiskey on their kitchen countertop, it probably wouldn't end up well for them a lot of the time. It probably would not end up very well for them a lot of the time. That's a much worse thing to be addicted to than porn, for sure, because that can kill you. Porn can do a lot of things. It messed up my mind. It messed up a lot of people's minds, but it can't kill you at the end. At least I don't think, at the end of the day. Maybe by, hemorrhaging your dick or something, but I don't know. But that was, all that other kind of stuff. But it's all an individualized thing. So that was my personal reference point that I used. But it can be, I think, anyone's kind of personal hell that they're going through that they use to cope with their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. You got me stuck on hemorrhaging your dick. It was very good.
Well, yeah, that's it.
I was like, this way.
Maybe that's probably the only way it can kill you, but I don't know, unless you're into some really weird shit.
You could. I mean, I'm sure there's some creative ways that you could have some sort of Final Destination issue pop up.
Oh, for sure. Yes.
Where it goes around. I'm sure in some backwards porn somewhere it's out there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So, But I mean, I commend you on being able to do that. Not a lot of people can like talk about the most thing that the thing that they have the most insecurity about, right, and make it incredibly public, and to actually say, hey, I'm addicted to porn, I'm into these things, right. And I think we all have different addictions, and I think right now like porn is it's just so easy. It's such an easy pleasure button. It's like, well, you could work out really hard and do something really hard and challenge yourself, or you could just do this for a couple of minutes, and there's the universe of naked people, and you get anything you want, right, as much as you want, and all you got to do is click a button. And that's the thing, is like right now we have everything's around, and the challenge is we have to kind of wade through that to try to do stuff that makes us proud. It's just hard. It's hard. It's a hard shit to do. I want to touch on this because I think it's super impressive. Putting out there a message of something that shame lives in a vacuum, right? So when you go online, you say, hey, addicted to porn, right? And that's the one thing I've talked about. I've talked about crapping my pants on ayahuasca and just completely clogging the toilet. I've had full conversation. I've gone out, right, and it's very, but they're very personal kind of conversations that there's a lot of shame around it until you get that out there. Can you talk to me about? Have you always been able to? Is there another time where you've had to put something out there that was incredibly personal and private, as public as possible? I think that's a really powerful thing for starting to form a lack of a better term, a more powerful identity of being able to endure the judgments of other people. Are there anything else that you've seen, or can you talk to me more about the experiences of taking something incredibly private and making it incredibly public?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Tim Kennedy, who is a former UFC fighter and a Green Beret, and I think an all-around great human being. I actually work out at his boxing gym. I've never met him tonight. So, Tim, if you listen to this podcast, then, shout out to you. But, so what up, Tim? And I think, so Tim has a saying or a line that I think is very, very powerful, where there's two, he said, I think it's something like there's two, I would say the most two powerful forces in a human being's life are failure and shame. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And so those are two things. And that's literally all of the book in part. And I have a saying with all my blogs, all my podcasts, and with my book, because there are times, especially when I'm talking about something going on in the world or something, where I go after some people for something that I don't think is right, that people are doing and everything else that needs to be paid attention to. But I have a saying that I will never be harder on anyone else in the world than I'm hard on myself. And I basically, in order to get people to take me seriously, and I didn't want to come from this kind of, I would say, self-help, typical like cliche self-help con artist type of person where I'm this greatest person in the world and you people are bad and you need to fix your shit and everything else and I'm perfect and all this other kind of stuff. So I wanted to basically do the complete inverse and say that I am this imperfect, messed up person who's done all these things. And I let that bear, I think, a lot throughout the book. Like, I had a 1.02 GPA in my sophomore year of college. I almost failed out of school. Like, I got, I talked about the time I got, punched in the face and beat up by people and bullied and online harassed and all these type of things and everything like that. So my failures with women, that's another big thing. That was kind of what led, I think, to a lot of the porn addiction stuff, was because I was literally afraid of women for most of my life. And I talked about that very, very openly. And I think that, the only way to get people to be vulnerable and confront themselves is to confront yourself first. And so I wanted to be able to do that in a forum where I could really just kind of put the onus on myself to maybe be open and vulnerable. And it was very, very powerful to me, honestly. It felt like an exorcism, that I got a lot of weight lifted on my shoulders from doing that. And I had talked to people privately about some of that stuff and everything, and a lot of my insecurities and my failures and my shame and everything like that. But I think, it was very, very, I would say, therapeutic for me at the end of the day. I don't know if that answers your question, but that was kind of what I...
It does. And I think it's an important lesson that I think, is good to know for myself and for everybody else, is that like people go like, how do I become super powerful? How do I become amazingly strong? How do I become the person that knows going to lead me on to victory? It's like, okay, take the thing you absolutely fear the most and share it as publicly and openly as possible. And everyone goes,
Yep. And it's natural, right? And I get it.
For sure, man.
Yeah.
Dude, for sure. Like, I mean, it's supernatural it's natural to be afraid of women, because we have this whole tribal instinct thing, man. It's like, if we get rejected by that woman, the other woman's going to see us, and then no one's going to want to sleep with us, and then our genes get kicked out of the tribe, and then we die. Right. Yep. And it always leads down to then we die. Right. And there's that judgment about like wanting people to accept us, but you also want that. That's why I think it's cool. Like, we talk about being a nobody, and you talk about having, porn issues, that we've all had porn issues. We're like, man, I think I'm clearly jerking off way too much. I need to take a break.
Yeah.
And I'll dehydrate it or whatever the thing might be.
Yeah.
The people relate to that. Like, it's super relatable. And I think in order for people hate it when you preach from the top of the mountain saying, I'm amazing. Yep. You're like, versus like, hey, I'm just as much as a dirtbag as you are. I just do it way less often now. This is how I did it. Come this way. Or or go this way, should I say. So like, I think it's really powerful, man. I think it's beautiful that you got people, you're able to put that out there and take that position.
Thank you.
And push that way. Failures and shame. The two most powerful forces in people's lives is failure and shame. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very true. And I think, to go off that point a little bit more, I opened the book with basically the story of Chris Farley, who in my opinion is the funniest person I've ever seen in my entire life. And I think, like, I literally, like, Chris Farley to me, I've said this to people before, like the people who really kind of know this about me. I have a good, my parents grew up and they were young adults in their 20s and the 90s. So they grew up with, that type of Saturday Night Live with, Mike Myers and Adam Sandler and Dana Carvey and Phil Hartman and all these people. Chris Farley obviously was the funniest out of all of them, I think. And so we had all those people kind of going in that kind of direction. And so Chris Farley, I don't view him as a person. I view him as like an entity, as like just a thing, like a thing that is like, because he was so uniquely gifted with what he did. And he was so uniquely kind of like, I've never seen anything like him to this day. I've seen maybe people that are close to him, but not really, honestly. And the problem with Chris Farley is that he had all of his insecurities. And so he bottled them up and didn't share them. And he ended up really, really destroying his life in a lot of ways. And I opened the 10th chapter with basically the story of kind of how he, how a lot of people viewed him after his death and stuff. And, there was this quote by Bob Odenkirk, who's the star of Better Call Saul, and he was also in Breaking Bad. He's a famous comedian, famous writer. And, he said that, and he wrote the famous motivational speaker sketch, which is what I opened the book with, which is Matt Foley, motivational speaker. He wrote that sketch back when they were in Chicago and at Second City. And, he said, he's like, and he was interviewed in a biography about Chris Farley. And he said, with Chris, there's a certain limit to where it all kind of stops for me. And that limit is where you kill yourself with drugs and alcohol. And that limit is where it stops being so fucking magical. And I think that's really, really powerful. And it's really, really true because, when you really kind of bottle everything up and you don't talk about it, that's hell, because you don't really know. You feel like you're by yourself and you feel like you're suffering so individually horribly, and you can't do anything about it because you won't open up about it, which is really, really horrible. And too many people do it, in my opinion.
Yeah, man, I completely agree in the terms of, I put in that famous quote of like, most people live lives of quiet desperation, going to the grave with a song unsung, is that they don't put themselves out there. And the thing about Chris Farley is he was like unabashedly himself. I mean, wild and crazy and extreme and out there and so fun. And, and as you're saying, I can't help to hear him go, living in a van down by the river, right? You just hear it, right? And it makes you smile because he was just, you could feel his energy. And it could channel the inner Chris Farley. The thing though is, you're right. There's a cost for that extremeness, right? And we're trying to find this balance. And I think what's interesting, what you're talking about, this is you have this like identity issue, right? Which comes to the ego, right? The ego wants to have this identity. It wants to be in congruency with this identity, and wants to keep what this thing is alive, right? I am this type of person. I am not this type of person, right? So you're trying to hold on to that piece, but sometimes it gets rampant, it gets out of control, and then you can go extreme in the whole Chris Farley range of stuff. What have you seen in terms of like, because obviously that's like an overindulgence, hedonism kind of thing, what somebody values. What have you seen in terms of, I think, value identification is one of them, saying like, I am self-worth if I've earned it through respect. Have you seen other patterns by looking at other people, of what are good values to have, or ones that you've seen that have created happiness, or any of those things that have stood out to you as value sets that are, I don't want to say worthy of having, but maybe create for a more healthy and content person?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are, and I think Douglas Murray has said before, and I think this is actually a very, very wise thing to understand, is that if you want to find meaning in your life, if you want to have value in your life, look where others have found it before. And I think there's a lot of truth in that to a lot of ways, because you have to look at the history of humankind and see, like, okay, when people were, I would say, maybe in a better place inside of themselves, and this can be as unilateral as your family wide, this can be like worldwide, whatever. I think people who have a sense of religious values, who value their family, who value their community, who value kind of what they do, the people they work with, their children, everything else. So I think a lot of things around community, a lot of things around centered on a higher power or belief system, no matter what that is. I'm a Christian, but I know a lot of people. I know my one of my best friends back at Ohio, in Columbus, who is devout Muslim, and he's very, very happy. He's a very, very happy person. And I know a lot of people who are atheists that are very happy people. And so I think that having that kind of sense that there's something bigger than you, I call it remembering your smallness. So you have to remember kind of how small you are in this whole grand scheme of things. And so I think a greater sense of that there's something greater out there than you, that there's a bigger thing out there than you, and taking that responsibility to say that, this thing supersedes me in some way or another, and I should probably do my best to honor that thing in the best way possible, whether that is a romantic partner, whether that's a child, whether that's a person you're mentoring, whether that's someone that is mentoring you, all this, a teacher, a coach, everything else. So I think it comes down to a lot of, I think, values that are centered around relationships. So reciprocity, mutual respect, affection, paying it forward to other people, all that, those other kind of things. And it can be personalized to all the people that really read this book and want to come up with a value system. And I encourage that inside of the book. I say, like, look, I have really 1 or 2 word values for my values, but there are people that make like whole value statements for each one of their values. And I love that. I love that about people. So it's really kind of tailored to that individual level. And I think whatever that individual really thinks is the most effective way for them to absorb a higher system of values, that should be the way they go, at least in my opinion.
So do you feel like, there's a couple of questions around that, but do you feel like, I mean, with the use of your book is to help people identify like what their values are and their sets are and get really clear around that and be able to kind of, at the end of that, is the result from going through your book an ability and a process to identify and integrate your values into your own life? Is that kind of what the thing is?
Yeah. So the way I kind of framed it, and this is kind of the book description, both on Amazon and on the inside of the book, if you look in the hardcover jacket or on the back cover, is that there's so much of a industry that's built around self-help, and it's great. I'm glad that people want to help other people, and I'm glad that we have people that are really smart in fields of diet and health and nutrition and mental health and physical health and kind of relationships and romantics and everything like that, and literature. But I think that there is a limit to that. And the limit to that is, how can you help yourself if you don't know who you are in the first place? And so the way I'm positioning my book is that, this is obviously the very ambitious goal of this, is that this book is the book you have to read before you try to help yourself in any way, shape, or form ever. Because if you don't know that you're helping yourself for the right reasons, then what's the point of even undertaking that activity in the first place? Because you could be helping yourself for the wrong reasons. Like, what if you don't really need help in this specific area? You just need to tweak this one thing and you'll be fine. What if you don't need to do this? What if you might need to do something else? What if you need to, totally reinvent the way that you're looking at something in the first place? So that was kind of the overall goal and everything, is to realize what is important to them and then go on that route of self-improvement if you see the fit to improve yourself in those areas.
That makes sense. It's so you're talking about, hey, if you want to get somewhere, right? And a lot of the younger generation, they're really focused a lot around, hey, what's my purpose? What's my values? I don't want to just be a 9-to-5er. I want to have meaning. I want to move towards a mission and go, great. Well, what's your value? What's your mission? What's your purpose? Like, I don't have one. Okay, well then do anything, because you don't have one. You can't. It's like saying I want to go somewhere else that's just not here. But where do you want to go? I don't know. And that involves, mala beads and wandering the forest barefoot. And,
like
moving to
Don
Austin,
Draper
Texas.
At the end of type shit.
Yeah.
Never seen again for like 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah, man. So it's just got to figure that thing out. And I mean, I think people search that, but the only way you do that is you got to be able to sample a bunch of things, right? I mean, I think I'm sure that Austin, Texas is very different culturally and value driven wise than Cleveland. I'm sure that, what you find, you kind of sample things, and like some things taste well and some things don't, and that could be the same thing with religions and everything else that people do. Is I think, it's so hard when you don't have any sense of anything, especially if you're being told this is the way things should be. It kind of reminds me, or it makes me think about in terminology, it's not a word, but if you're looking at it like it's almost like a ginger palate cleanser, your book is to say, okay, you've tried all this other stuff. Let's wipe it and start from zero and say, this is where we're going to start with. Okay, what do you value? Do you really value it? Are you willing to pay a price for what you value? And great, then okay, then this is where you're at now. Because it's hard if people want to coach you. If someone's going to, because coaches are great. Like the humanity, like the history of mankind, this whole podcast, Hero's Journey, helping people along, is that we come from countless generations that have helped pass the baton for us to move forward, which is amazing and helpful. But we also get the weird traumas that come along with it and all these other stuff that come along with all the things that allowed us to survive, because we were here to survive and move along, not necessarily to be completely fulfilled and purpose-driven beings.
Right.
So along that path, is there things around looking at your value sets by looking at your traumas, or is there things that are there things that you go in there to help people kind of find out what they really value? It's because I can see that the trade-off to kind of say you can show me it by the things that you've been willing to give up, but there are other ways to be able to find what you value.
Yeah, and I think that kind of it deals with something similar. And I remember one of the openings of one of the chapters is basically saying that pain is a double-edged sword in a lot of ways, because people it's easy to learn to run away, that we can be hurt by things that harm us, basically. Like, this is the don't touch the hot stove thing when you're a kid. Like, you touch the hot stove once, to not touch the hot stove again. Yeah. But in other ways, we have to learn as human beings that pain can be used for constructive things and can be used for good things. And so I think that the value of pain is both learning. It's very hard to navigate this, because there are ways that you can, get value out of your pain. But again, you run into the diminishing returns of value problem, and you run off a cliff. and so, it's all kind of it's all about a balance, right? So, I mean, you don't want to go through something that is harming. Like, you don't want to go and say, like, okay, this person on the internet said that I'll be, happy if I chop my left arm off. And you don't want to do that, because I mean, there's not a lot of, unless you have like a, we've invented cybernetics, and you can put like a robot, laser cannon on the side of your arm, which would be really cool. But you can't do that at this point. That would be really cool. But if we can't do that at this point. So, okay, like, this isn't Star Wars. We can't really do that kind of stuff yet. So how can we leverage kind of what that learning mechanism is in order to really kind of run away from the bad stuff and run towards the good stuff, while also growing in the process? And that feeds into a lot of principles inside of the book. But I think that's a really, really big thing that people can take away from. The role of the phrase life is suffering is a very, very real thing in all religions. And I know it's primarily a Buddhist phrase, but there is a very, it is, I think, the thread that runs through all religions. Certainly I'm a Christian, so it certainly runs through Christianity. It runs through a lot of other religions and thoughts and everything else like that. And I think the positive side of suffering is a very, very real thing. And people need to, I think, just identify that it is a real thing.
Yeah, the diminishing returns. I'm sure there is a point where you can only hit yourself in the hand with a hammer so many times before you go like, okay, man, is this really serving what you need?
Yep.
Which I think is also the same thing of that whole self-love, and same thing in terms of self-respect is like, okay, am I gonna pull the lesson out of this thing and go, okay, all right, maybe I didn't do it right this time, but next time I'm gonna do it right. And it reminds me a lot about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Sure.
That right? You're talking a lot about the pain, as long as you can find the purpose behind the pain. The pain stops being painful as soon as it serves a purpose to a degree, because now it becomes meaningful, right? Same way a mom would jump in front of a bus to protect a child. It would be more pain, but it'd have a deeper purpose. But you got to figure out, are you willing to sacrifice for your value set so it has meaning? So because I would say the value and sacrifice equals meaning. So, which is absolutely which is super, super interesting stuff. So with you and all this stuff that you're trying to create, right, and have this be the anti-help book to help people help themselves along the way, which is a conundrum in and of itself. Do you have, like, you talked about the big mission and vision of this? Can you restate that? Because I would say, what is your flag on top of this? If this book was to do X, Y, and Z, or you're able to achieve this goal and it would be worth it, what is what I'd say holy grail?
So I was talking to, actually, it was funny. I was mailing some autographed copies of my book out to some family and friends yesterday. And so I was at the UPS store, and I had, a set of 10 books. And I was also talking to group of, I think, two brothers that run this Instagram page that, they wanted 25 of them to give out to their readers. So I was very grateful for that. So I had like a large amount, like I literally have 70 hard copies of my book that I'm not going to use. So I'm like, please take them and like take them out of my house. And so I was, giving, all these other things. And I had this massive stack of books in the UPS store. And obviously when, someone is shipping out a massive number of one thing, no matter what they be, you're going to draw some eyeballs. And so then obviously there are people that are piling up behind me and behind this UPS store. And I'm feeling like the dick that's holding up the line who's like, when like you're behind that person Chipotle that's ordering like the 5 Chipotle bowls and you're like, oh my God, like, this person's
you are the dick. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. Right. So I was that guy. And so I was like letting all these people like kind of go in front of me because these people that had like an Amazon package to return, they just scanning QR code, whatever. And so this lady behind me, she was mailing something and she picks up a copy of my book and then she's like, did you write this? And I said, well, yeah, you can go ahead and take a look at it. I really don't care. And so that was kind of cool. And so she's like, she asked me kind of the same questions, like what, and she was kind of like in, I live in Austin, Texas. So it's kind of like in, a lot of artsy people down here. And she was like one of those people. She wasn't like quite Mala Beads, like you mentioned before, but she was pretty close. And so she's like, and then she kind of asked me in a very kind of like wispy voice, she's like, what is your purpose of writing this book and everything, the kind of that nature? And I just kind of said off the cuff, I was just kind of so, not really upset about it, but I was just kind of, a lot of people had asked me at this point since I've been so vocal about, me, the fact that I was writing a book. And she said, and I just kind of said, I want people to rediscover the beauty of individualism. And she was like, oh, and then, so at the end of the day, I think that's what I want to do. I think individual people are beautiful people. And I think that I think human beings are fascinating. I think they're very interesting people. And I think that if the general message of the book is that individualism matters and having something to stand to put the rock under your proverbial church that is your life, then I think the book will have served its purpose. And I think for most of the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive by this point. So I'm so grateful for that from the people who have read it and understood it. But I want people to rediscover that, individualism matters and that it really means something in their lives.
Yeah. So the Holy Grail is to have a collective resonance with being an individual. Yeah. That's funny and ironic. So I think it's true though. We like so much. I think a lot of times we with the area of like, if you look at the culture of the U.S., right, it's very much me first, go, and we kind of grinded, right? Versus say if you go to Japan. Japan's all about a team sport, right?
Yeah.
That's why there's very little pollution, or not pollution, like litter and stuff like that. There's a lot of social pressures. Hey, man, we're all in an island. Be cool, right?
Yeah, right.
Various terminology, right? Versus the U.S., we come to conquer individually, sail to west, my way, the own way, like, the lone cowboy, right? There's a lot of stuff going on there. But then we got to a point where, I think the pendulum kind of swings with the whole like, hey, let's all be accepted. Let's be part of the group. Let's all, and then it's very hard for us to have that individual self. I mean, it's super easy to stand for something that everybody stands for, right?
Sure.
And in that collective thing, but really being a true individual, having people see all the ugly sides of you and standing for something, I think is something that's it's a really big challenge to get someone to individually stand for something that they personally believe, knowing that people will judge them a certain way for holding those beliefs. Mm-hmm. That's a really big challenge. What do you think is what I would call the greatest dragon, the thing preventing people from really stepping out and being individuals and putting this stuff out there, doing what you did, like putting things out there that may not be accepted and might be ridiculed, but they still are congruent with their individuality?
I think it's fear. I think a lot of it is fear, especially now, to your point about, the culture today is that, there's a lot of societal pressure and there's a lot of peer pressure. And you see people getting either, they get, quote unquote canceled, or they kind of, they get, ousted from a friend group. We've seen people get fired over some of the things that they believe and everything. So, and there's reason to be afraid, but there's also reason that fear is, I don't know how to really phrase that, but I think I think the thing is that basically, don't be so sure that the devil you don't know is better than the devil that you do know. And so that one exists, where if you do step out and start saying what you actually think about things or acting in your individual values, there's something to be said for that. And there's a legitimate fear that comes with that. But there also is a fear for not following and towing the line of everyone else when you really, and if you actually believe what they're saying to be true, then that is a very, very okay thing. Like if you actually believe in a set of values, that should be encouraged, and go ahead and believe that thing. But if you don't, you're just going along with it, you're cheating to yourself and you're lying to yourself about a lot of things. And I don't think that's very okay to do to yourself as a person. Like, you owe it to yourself to be honest. And so I would say, don't be so sure of yourself if you really don't feel that sure of yourself, because odds are, if you don't really find yourself in complete lockstep, which I don't think hardly anybody does with, whatever any person says, then, I think it's fear that prevents a lot of us to really kind of slay that big dragon you're talking about. And I think that, again, breaking it away and chipping it away one layer at a time is going to be probably the biggest way to go about, fixing that problem.
Yeah, I think it's great, man. The don't be so sure that the devil you know, or the devil that you don't know, is worse than the devil you do. And I think that's right with a lot of these. There's these pieces that people want to get to another place, right? That value and sacrifice, but they're not willing to let go of whatever the things they're comfortable at, right? Even though it makes them unhappy. It's so much easier to lie. It's so much easier to whatever. It's so much easier to do this thing. And I know this and I'm comfortable with it. I'm safe with the thing. But we do this other thing, then, all these bad things could happen, which they absolutely could.
And again, there's a lot of validity to that.
That's true. It's totally true, man.
Yeah,
totally true. But there's an absolute power in that, though. But if you're willing to taste it, not let that devil fear you and rule you, but actually, be able to, bravely step into it and say, oh, okay, and then choose with actual knowledge what path you want to go on, based on the fact that you're willing to sample a lot of different devils. I think you can get to where you want to go. I think it's been beautiful. Sam, it's been awesome having you on the podcast. It's been great jamming with you. Is there anything else you'd like to let people know about before you tell them how to get a hold of you or your book?
I would just say, anything inside of the book. I think, I built this book for basically, it's not meant to follow a particular set of ideology. I think everyone can read this book and get something out of it. And this is not me trying to sell books. Well, it is, but it's not. But, I think, at least, I would say just, give it a try. And just what I encourage at the end of the book, in the very last, I would say, paragraph of it, and, just think about these things, meditate on them, think about them, ask yourself questions, make them hard questions, and then see where you're at. And then reassess, and then do that again and again and again. And I think that you will probably end up in a better spot before you did that, or after you did that exercise, than before you did it.
Love it. And Sam, if people want to get a hold of you or the book, how do they do that?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Sam LaCrosse, like the sport, capital C as is the C in the last name. My Instagram is @RealSamLax, LAX. And then my book is Value Economics, Study of Identity. And it's on all platforms, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's got, I think around 4.7 stars on Amazon right now out of a couple dozen reviews. That's awesome. And then my blog, I write blogs on don'treadthisblog.com, but don't listen to this podcast. It's on all streaming platforms. And again, just thank you for having me on, Dylan. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. All right. Have a blessed and beautiful day. I'll see you on the other side. Take care now.
Thanks, man. You too.
Bye. See you.
Thank you for listening to the Heroes of Reality podcast. Check out heroesofreality.com for more episodes. While you're there, you can also take the Heroes Quiz to find out what kind of hero you are. Or, if you have a great story and want to be on the podcast, tell us why your hero's journey will inspire others.